Where exactly does a girl who works at a tailor shop find a dress like that? The ballroom went silent. Preston Whitfield had invited her as a joke, a punchline. He'd told Channel 9 to point their cameras at the door, so the whole county could watch a poor girl in a discount dress stand next to women wearing diamonds. Then Addie Mercer walked in. Ivory silk, hand-stitched beading. A gown so beautiful the string quartet stopped playing mid-note. A fashion appraiser pushed through the crowd, lifted the collar, and went very still. "Miss Mercer," she said, "do you have any idea what you're wearing? $2 million. And stitched inside that collar, in silver thread almost too small to see, were two initials that would tear the Whitfield family apart. Because 30 years ago, they buried a woman's name in this town. Tonight, that name walked back through the front door. Some towns keep their secrets in old houses. Ashworth Falls kept its secrets in old money. You could feel it the moment you crossed the town line. Trimmed hedges, brick sidewalks, a courthouse clock that had chimed the same 12 notes for over 100 years. Behind every polished window sat a name that mattered more than the person holding it. The town had grown up slowly around 3 or 4 families the way small towns often do. A hospital wing here, a library wing there. Streets renamed, one at a time, until half the map read like a family tree instead of a set of directions. People who had lived in Ashworth Falls long enough stopped noticing it after a while. It simply became the shape of the town, the way water takes the shape of whatever holds it. Addie Mercer wasn't one of those names. She was 24 years old, tired eyes, steady hands. She had come to Ashworth Falls for one reason only. Her grandmother, Vivian Mercer, had lived in this town longer than anyone could remember. Now she lived in a small room at Brookhaven Senior Residence, 3 miles past Main Street, where the paint peeled and the heating rattled at night. A stroke had taken her voice 2 years ago. It hadn't taken her mind. Addie visited every evening. Right after her shift at the tailor shop, she'd pull a chair beside the bed, take her grandmother's hand, talk about nothing important. The weather, the bus schedule, a customer who complained about a button. Vivian would listen. Her eyes followed every word. Sometimes something mattered more than small talk. Then she'd lift one finger, slow and deliberate, toward a small plastic board resting on her lap. Letters lined up in neat rows. The hospital had given her that board 2 years ago, the same week the stroke took her voice. A nurse had placed it in her hands and told her something simple. "You still have things left to say. This will help you say them." She did have things left to say, she just needed time. Addie had learned to wait. She had learned that patience wasn't weakness. It was the only kindness she had left to give some days. She hadn't always lived in Ashworth Falls. She grew up 2 states over, in a string of small apartments that never quite felt permanent. Her mother had chased one dream after another. A new city, a new man, a new promise that never lasted more than a season. Vivian had been the one constant. Every summer, Addie's mother would drop her off at Brookhaven for a few weeks. Back then, Vivian still lived on her own, in a modest house near the edge of town. Vivian would teach her to sew on an old machine that clattered like a train. "A stitch holds if you're patient with it," Vivian used to tell her. "Rush it, and it falls apart the first time someone leans on it." Addie hadn't understood the lesson back then. She understood it now. When the stroke came 2 years ago, Addie packed what little she owned and moved to Ashworth Falls for good. Nobody else in the family had offered to come. Nobody else in the family had bothered to ask if Vivian was scared. Addie had asked. Every single evening since, most mornings before her shift, Addie ran the same short loop through downtown, past the courthouse, past the library with the Whitfield name carved above its doors, past the diner with its fogged-up windows and the smell of coffee drifting out onto the sidewalk. She liked the quiet of it, the town before it fully woke up, before the names on the buildings started to matter again. It was during one of those mornings, weeks before any of this began, that she'd first noticed something odd. An older woman, walking her dog past the tailor shop, had stopped and stared at the front window for a long moment before continuing on. Addie hadn't thought much of it at the time. She would think of it again later, once she understood exactly what that woman might have been looking for. The tailor shop sat on the corner of 5th and Larch, wedged between a shuttered bookstore and a diner that had served the same meatloaf every Tuesday since 1987. Owen Brooks had run it for almost 30 years. He was somewhere past 60, though he never gave a straight answer when asked. Broad shoulders, calloused fingers, a voice like gravel dragged over velvet. He'd hired Addie 6 months ago. He found her outside the bus station one cold evening, sewing a torn coat sleeve for a stranger. She wasn't charging him a dime. "You've got good hands," Owen told her that day. Good hands and a soft heart. Rare combination. Usually it's one or the other. She'd worked for him ever since, hemming trousers, mending jackets, listening to Owen complain about the price of thread, right before he quietly gave a free repair to someone who couldn't pay. The shop wasn't fancy. A single sewing machine near the window, bolts of fabric stacked against the back wall, a bell above the door that rang a little off-key. Regulars came in and out all day. Mrs. Patterson, who needed her husband's old suit taken in every winter, a little more each year. Young Danny from the hardware store forever losing buttons off his work shirts. An older man named Frank who came in every Friday just to talk, whether he needed a stitch fixed or not. Frank had lived in Ashworth Falls his whole life, same as most of the older customers. He liked to talk about the town the way it used to be, back before half the storefronts on Main Street turned into empty windows with faded for lease signs. "This shop used to be something else, you know," he told Addie once, settling into the chair by the window like he did most Fridays, long before Owen's time. "I was just a boy, but I remember the window display. Prettiest thing I ever saw." "What kind of shop?" Addie had asked, only half listening at the time, focused on a hem that refused to sit straight. Frank had waved a hand, the memory clearly slipping from him the way old memories sometimes do. "Couldn't tell you now," he admitted. "Just remember it was pretty, real pretty." Addie hadn't thought anything of it that day. It wasn't much of a life, some might say. But it was honest. And after everything Addie had been through, honest felt like enough. She had grown up watching her own mother chase things that glittered and vanished. Fast money, fast promises. None of it had ever stayed. By the time Addie turned 18, she had learned the value of something plain and steady instead. A needle, a thread, a promise you could actually keep. That was worth more to her than any gold lettering ever could be. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Thick cream paper, gold lettering. A wax seal pressed into the corner, like something out of another century. Addie found it wedged in her mailbox, squeezed between a phone bill and a flyer for a pizza place that had closed last spring. She almost threw it away without opening it. "What is that?" Owen asked. He was wiping his hands on his apron as she walked into the shop, turning the envelope over twice in her hands. "I don't know," she said. "It's addressed to me." She slid her thumb under the seal. Inside was a single card embossed in gold script. "You are cordially invited to the 35th Annual Whitfield Charity Gala. Black tie, Saturday evening. Ashworth Falls Country Club." Addie read it twice. "This has to be a mistake," she said. Owen leaned over her shoulder. He squinted at the card. His face changed the moment he saw the name printed at the bottom, Preston Whitfield IV. He set down the shirt he'd been folding. "It's not a mistake," he said quietly. "It's worse than that." Preston Whitfield IV had never worked a day in his life. He saw no reason to start now. He was 27. He had the kind of jaw people photographed for magazine covers, the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. His family's name was stitched into half the buildings downtown. The Whitfield Library, the Whitfield Wing at the hospital, the Whitfield Charity Gala, held every year at the country club his grandfather had built. For over 3 decades, that gala had raised money for the town's elderly. Meals, medicine, heat in the winter months, or so most people believed. The Whitfield Charitable Foundation itself had grown quickly in its early years, back in the early 90s, expanding faster than anyone in town could quite explain. Old-timers sometimes joked that the Whitfields must have found buried treasure somewhere behind the country club. Nobody ever asked too many questions. Questions, in Ashworth Falls, had a way of costing more than they were worth. Preston sat in the club's private lounge that afternoon, surrounded by 3 of his closest friends, each one dressed in the same easy confidence that money buys. "The board wants my father to hand me the chair," Preston said, swirling the ice in his glass. "They think I'm not serious enough." "You? Not serious?" One friend laughed. "You've never been serious about anything in your life." A second friend, quieter than the rest, glanced up from his phone. "Maybe they've got a point, Preston. Maybe you should just show up, act responsible for one night, and let the board say that." "Boring," Preston said, waving the suggestion away. "Responsible doesn't make headlines. Responsible doesn't get remembered. Exactly my point, Preston continued. I need something. A moment. Something people will still be talking about for weeks. He tapped his fingers on the armrest, thinking. Then he smiled, slow and sharp, like a man who just found the punchline to a joke only he understood. There's a girl, he said. New in town. Works at the tailor shop on 5th. So we invite her to the gala. His friends exchanged a look. Why would we do that? Preston leaned forward, eyes bright. Because everyone will be watching when she walks in wearing something off a discount rack. Standing next to women in gowns, worth more than her whole apartment. Channel 9 is covering the event this year. Can you imagine the footage? The look on her face when she realizes what she's standing in? One friend, Whitney, tilted her head. That's cruel, Preston. It's entertainment, he corrected, and it solves my problem. The board wants a moment. I'll give them one. Whitney didn't argue further, but she didn't laugh either. She just looked down at her glass and said nothing more. What if she doesn't come? Another friend, Bradley, asked. Some people can smell a setup a mile off. She'll come, Preston said confidently. People like her never get invitations like this. Curiosity always wins. And if the board doesn't find it funny? Preston shrugged. The board wants a moment. They didn't say it had to be a nice one. He checked his phone, already thinking 3 steps ahead. A production assistant from Channel 9 had confirmed their crew would arrive by 7. Plenty of time to set the stage exactly how he wanted it. Relax, he told his friends. By Sunday morning, nobody in this town will remember anything else. He had no idea how right he'd turn out to be. Just not for the reason he thought. Preston raised his own glass, already picturing the headline in his mind. He had no idea, not yet, how right he was about one thing. It would be a moment nobody in that town would ever forget. Just not the moment he was expecting. Whitfield, Owen said again, setting the invitation down on the counter like it might bite him. You don't know what that name means around here. I've heard it, Addie said. It's on half the buildings in town. It's on more than buildings. Owen rubbed the back of his neck. That family funds the senior center, the meal program. Half the medical assistance folks around here rely on. Addie felt something tighten in her chest. Vivian's care, she said quietly. Is that connected? Owen didn't answer right away. Some of it, he finally said. Some of the funding for Brookhaven runs through the Whitfield Foundation. Not all of it, but some. Addie looked down at the invitation again. She didn't know Preston Whitfield personally. She'd only seen him once, driving too fast through downtown, in a car that cost more than her entire apartment building was probably worth. But she knew people like him. She'd grown up watching people like him decide who mattered and who didn't, with the same ease they used to order coffee. Why would he invite me, she asked. He doesn't even know me. Owen's jaw tightened. Because it's not really an invitation, he said. It's a trap dressed up in gold lettering. You think he wants to embarrass me? I think, Owen said slowly. That boy has never once in his life invited someone to a party out of kindness. I think you should throw that card in the trash and forget you ever saw it. Addie folded the card back into its envelope. Part of her agreed with him completely. Another part of her, quieter, wouldn't stop asking a question she couldn't answer yet. Why did the name Whitfield make something twist behind her grandmother's eyes every single time it came up in conversation? She hadn't even mentioned it to Vivian yet, and still, somehow, she already suspected the answer wouldn't be simple. She brought it up that evening, sitting beside Vivian's bed, the invitation resting on her lap. I got the strangest thing in the mail today, Addie said, keeping her voice light. An invitation to the Whitfield Charity Gala. She hadn't expected a reaction. She got one anyway. Vivian's hand resting on the blanket went still, not relaxed. Still the way a held breath is still. Her eyes moved to Addie's face, sharp and sudden, in a way they hadn't moved in weeks. Grandma? Vivian's finger lifted, slow, and drifted toward the plastic board on her lap. Addie leaned closer. She watched each letter as her grandmother tapped it out, one at a time, patient despite the effort it clearly cost her. H.O. Addie blinked. Who invited me? A man named Preston Whitfield. He's young. He runs the gala now. His family. Vivian's hand cut through the air, sharp, stopping her mid-sentence. Her finger moved again, slower this time, like each letter carried real weight. Anode. Vivian's eyes filled with tears. Her hand trembled, but she kept going anyway. Hermione. Addie stared at the board, then at her grandmother's face. Not mine, she said softly. What's not yours, Grandma? What do you mean? But Vivian had gone still again. exhausted. Her hand dropped back to the blanket. Her eyes closed, not from sleep, but from something closer to grief. Addie sat there a long time, holding her grandmother's hand, turning those two words over and over in her mind. Not mine. Whatever it meant, it mattered. She could feel it, the way you feel a storm coming before the sky ever changes color. On the small dresser beside the bed sat a single framed photograph. Vivian, much younger, standing outside a shop Addie didn't recognize. She'd always assumed it was somewhere Vivian had visited once, long ago. Now she wasn't so sure. The rest of the room held little else. A few paperback novels, their spines cracked from rereading. A small sewing kit Vivian could no longer use, kept anyway close at hand. A faded quilt, hand-stitched, that Addie had always assumed came from a store. She looked at that quilt differently now, studying the careful, even stitches along its border. Maybe nothing in this room was quite as ordinary as it had always seemed. She almost didn't mention the trunk. It had sat in the corner of the tailor shop's back room for as long as Addie had worked there, buried under bolts of fabric and boxes of buttons nobody used anymore. Old, wooden, locked. Owen had told her once it belonged to a former tenant. Left behind decades ago, never claimed by anyone. But that Thursday, while searching for a box of thread, Addie's foot caught the edge of it. The trunk shifted just enough to reveal something. A small brass plate on its side, half hidden under grime. She knelt down and wiped it clean with her sleeve. 2 initials, engraved in careful script. VM, her breath caught. Owen, she called out. Come look at this. He came from the front of the shop, wiping his hands on a rag. He stopped cold when he saw what she was pointing at. That's been here longer than I have, he said slowly. I always figured it belonged to whoever ran this place before me. Do you know who that was? Owen shook his head. Bought the building from a lawyer handling an old estate sale. Never met the original owner. Whole thing happened fast, back when I was still young enough to think fast deals were good deals. Addie ran her fingers over the initials again. VM Vivian Mercer. It could have been a coincidence. Ashworth Falls was small, but not so small that no other VM had ever lived there. Still, her hands were shaking as she searched for a key that didn't exist. Her mind kept circling back to 2 words tapped out slow and painful on a plastic board. Not mine, we should open it, Sheeda said. Owen hesitated. He glanced at the old lock, rusted shut with time. Whatever's in there has been locked up a long while, he said. Sometimes things stay locked for a reason. And sometimes, Addie said quietly, they stay locked because nobody was ever brave enough to open them. It took a screwdriver, a hammer, and 20 minutes of stubborn effort. The lock finally gave way with a groan that sounded almost like relief. The lid creaked open. Inside, folded with a care that spoke of someone who once knew exactly what they were doing, lay a gown. Even folded, even after decades in the dark, it was breathtaking. Deep ivory silk, catching what little light the back room offered. Hand stitch beading along the bodice, each stone sewn with a precision Addie had never seen outside of magazines. A label sewn carefully into the inner seam, read words in elegant script. House of Mercer Couture. Beneath the gown, wrapped in tissue paper gone yellow with age, sat a small stack of business cards, tied together with a faded ribbon. Addie picked one up. Her hands trembled around the fragile paper. Vivian Mercer, founder and head designer, House of Mercer Couture, Ashworth Falls. She sat back on her heels. The card slipped from her fingers. Owen, she whispered. This is my grandmother's name. Owen crouched beside her. He stared at the gown, at the card, at the initials on the trunk. Your grandmother, he said slowly, ran a fashion house. In this town? I don't know, Addie said. She's never mentioned it. Not once, not in 24 years. She thought of her grandmother's hand, shaking, as it tapped out 2 words on a plastic board. Not mine. Maybe that wasn't about the invitation at all. Maybe it was about something far bigger than a single party. Something locked away, hidden, buried under 30 years of silence, waiting for someone brave enough to finally open it. Owen locked up the shop early that evening. He sat across from Addie at the small table in the back room, the trunk still open between them, the gown resting carefully on a clean sheet. You should ask her about it, he said, straight out. Before this Saturday. I tried, Addie said. She only gave me 2 words. Not mine. 2 words can mean 100 different things, I know, Addie said. That's what scares me. Owen studied the gown a long moment, his expression unusually serious. I've lived in this town a long time, he said slowly. long enough to know when people go quiet about something on purpose. This whole town's got a habit of it when it comes to the Whitfield name. What do you mean? Owen shook his head. I mean, I've heard things over the years. Nothing solid, just the kind of talk that dies whenever a Whitfield walks into the room. Addie sat with that for a moment. Then maybe it's time somebody didn't stay quiet, she said. Owen didn't argue with her this time. She lifted the gown from the trunk that night, carried it home wrapped in an old bedsheet, careful the way you'd carry something sacred. At her apartment under the single overhead light, she laid it across her bed and finally saw it clearly. It wasn't just beautiful. It was extraordinary. Every seam was hand-finished, every bead placed with an artist's patience. The silk itself seemed to hold light differently than anything Addie had ever touched. Soft and heavy at once, like water woven into fabric. She thought about the invitation sitting on her kitchen table. She thought about Preston Whitfield's name, and the sharp, sudden way her grandmother's face had changed at the sound of it. She thought about a gala meant only to embarrass her. And slowly, standing there in the quiet of her small apartment, an idea began to form. Not out of anger, not out of pride, out of something closer to duty. If this gown belonged to her grandmother, if it carried whatever truth Vivian couldn't say out loud anymore, then maybe it deserved to be seen. Maybe Vivian deserved to be seen, even if Addie didn't yet understand why. She spent the next 2 days at the shop working alongside Owen during the day and the evenings at Vivian's bedside, asking gentle questions her grandmother couldn't fully answer. Small nods, small shakes of the head, nothing more. But on Friday night, sitting beside the bed one last time before the gala, Vivian did something new. She reached out and touched the gown itself, folded carefully in Addie's lap. Her fingers lingered there a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. It wasn't permission exactly. It was something closer to a blessing. Owen stopped by her apartment Saturday evening, just before she left. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking almost nervous himself. "You don't have to do this," he said. "Nobody would think less of you for staying home." "I know," Addie said, smoothing the silk at her waist. "You look like her," Owen said quietly. "I only saw one photograph, but you look exactly like her." Addie's throat tightened. "Good. For what it's worth," Owen added. "Whatever happens tonight, you walk in there holding your head up. You hear me? Whatever they say, whatever they think, you hold your head up. I will." He gave a short nod, satisfied, and stepped back to let her pass. "Go on then," he said. "Give them something to talk about." She sat in her car outside the apartment a long moment before finally starting the engine, the gown catching streetlight through the window like something alive. She thought of Frank and the shop window he could barely remember. She thought of the woman who'd once paused outside Owen's storefront, staring at nothing Addie could explain. Maybe this town remembered more than it let on. Maybe it simply needed the right reminder. She pulled out onto the street. She drove toward whatever waited for her at the country club. One hand rested lightly against the silk at her side. It felt steadier than she did. The night of the gala arrived wrapped in string lights and champagne. The Ashworth Falls Country Club had been transformed. Chandeliers glowed above white tablecloths. A string quartet played near the entrance, soft and formal, the kind of music meant only as background noise for important conversations. Preston stood near the main doors, dressed in a tuxedo that fit him like a second skin, greeting guests with the practiced charm of a man raised to believe every room belonged to him. "She's not actually coming," Whitney murmured beside him, scanning the crowd. "You really think that girl has the nerve?" "Oh, she's coming," Preston said, checking his watch. "I made sure of it. Told the front desk to let her in personally. Wouldn't want security turning her away before the fun even starts." Across the room, a cameraman from Channel 9 adjusted his lens. He was capturing wide shots of the crowd for the evening news segment. Preston had personally requested the crew focus near the entrance. "Trust me," he'd told the producer earlier that day, smiling in a way that gave nothing away. "You'll want good footage tonight." The guests mingled. Diamonds caught the light. Somewhere near the dessert table, an elderly woman in a modest blue dress stood quietly, watching the room with tired, careful eyes. Dorothy Hayes had attended this gala for over 20 years. She'd watched it change slowly, the way a wound changes when nobody bothers to clean it. Fewer familiar faces each year. More talk of investment portfolios. Less talk of the people this event was supposedly meant to help. She sipped her water and said nothing, the way she always did. Silence had kept her safe for a long time. Tonight, though she had no way of knowing it yet, that silence was about to be tested in ways she never expected. Addie stood outside the country club's entrance. The gown wrapped around her like something borrowed from another life. She hadn't done anything fancy with her hair. No jewelry, save for a small pair of earrings that had belonged to her mother. Just the dress. Simple and stunning, and a courage she wasn't entirely sure she still had. She thought of her grandmother's hand, tapping out 2 words. Not mine. Maybe tonight would help her finally understand why. She took a breath, straightened her shoulders, walked through the doors. Conversation didn't stop all at once. It happened in pieces. A woman near the bar noticed first, her champagne glass pausing halfway to her lips. Then the couple beside her. Then a small cluster near the dance floor, heads turning one by one like dominoes falling in slow motion. By the time Addie reached the center of the room, the entire hall had gone quiet. Even the string quartet faltered. The cellist glanced up mid-note. Preston turned, expecting to see an awkward girl in something cheap and ill-fitting. The punchline he'd been waiting all week to deliver. Instead, he saw a gown that looked like it belonged in a museum. Ivory silk catching the chandelier light. Beading that seemed to move like it was alive. A silhouette so precise, so deliberate, that even the wealthiest women in the room instinctively straightened, as if standing beside royalty. Whitney's mouth opened slightly. No sound came out. That's not, she started, then stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Preston felt something cold settle low in his stomach. He couldn't have explained why. The joke he'd built all week suddenly felt very far away. Near the bar, a retired judge named Harold Pruitt lowered his glasses to get a better look, murmuring something to his wife about craftsmanship he hadn't seen in decades. 2 tables over, a group of longtime board members went quiet mid-conversation, watching the ivory silk catch the light with something close to reverence. Even the club's oldest waiter paused near the kitchen doors. He had served 3 generations of Whitfield galas. He had never once looked twice at a guest. Tonight, tray balanced on one hand, he simply stared. Whatever this young woman was wearing, it didn't belong to tonight. It belonged to another time entirely. And somehow, it had found its way back into this room. Margaret Voss noticed the details first. She always did. 30 years appraising vintage fashion for auction houses across the country had trained her eye. She caught what ordinary people missed. She'd come to the gala as a guest, not a professional. Invited by an old friend on the board, she hadn't planned to work tonight. But the moment that gown entered the room, instinct took over completely. She moved through the crowd, her drink forgotten on a passing tray, until she stood close enough to see the beading up close. Hand-stitched. Every single bead. The kind of work that took months, not weeks. The kind of craftsmanship almost nobody practiced anymore. Not since factories learned to mimic it, cheaper and faster. "Excuse me," Margaret said softly, catching Addie's attention. "I'm so sorry to interrupt. My name is Margaret Voss. I work in fashion appraisal. Would you mind terribly if I looked at your gown a bit closer?" Addie hesitated, glancing around at the eyes still fixed on her. "I don't actually know much about it," she admitted. "It belonged to my grandmother." Margaret's eyebrows lifted slightly. "May I ask her name?" "Vivian Mercer." Something shifted across Margaret's face. Quick, unreadable. "Would you mind if I examined the inner seam?" Addie nodded. Margaret carefully lifted the edge of the bodice, searching until she found what she already suspected might be there. The label. House of Mercer Couture. Margaret went very still. "Ma'am," she said slowly, straightening up. "Do you have any idea what you're wearing right now?" Addie shook her head. "Should I?" Margaret glanced toward the small crowd that had gathered, quiet and watching, then back at Addie, weighing her words carefully. "I think," she said, "we should find somewhere a little more private to talk." Preston recovered his composure first, the way people like him always did, slipping back into charm like an old, familiar coat. "Well," he said loudly, drawing eyes toward himself, "isn't this a surprise? Didn't expect you to actually show up." Addie turned to face him, calm despite the pounding in her chest. "You did send the invitation," she said evenly. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the crowd, not entirely at her expense this time. Preston felt the shift subtle but unmistakable. "I did," he said, recovering. "Though I have to admit, I'm curious. Where exactly does a girl who works at a tailor shop find a dress like that?" The question was meant to cut. It was meant to remind everyone in the room, gently but pointedly, that she didn't belong here, that whatever she was wearing had to be borrowed, or fake, or stolen. Addie met his eyes without flinching. "It belonged to my grandmother," she said simply. "Your grandmother?" Preston repeated, a small smile playing at his lips. "And who exactly is your grandmother?" Before Addie could answer, Margaret stepped forward. Her voice cut cleanly through the noise of the room. "Her name," Margaret said, "is Vivian Mercer. And unless I am very much mistaken, which I rarely am, this gown is an original House of Mercer couture piece." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Preston's smile faltered, just slightly. "Never heard of it," he said, though something in his voice had changed, an edge creeping in where confidence used to be. Margaret tilted her head. "That's strange," she said, "because 35 years ago, House of Mercer Couture was considered one of the finest small design houses on the East Coast, before it simply vanished." The room had gone very quiet again. Dorothy Hayes, standing near the dessert table, set down her water glass. Her hand shook slightly against the tablecloth. She knew that name. She had known it for a very long time. Margaret asked for a private room. The club's manager, eager to avoid a scene, hurried to accommodate her. Addie followed, aware of every eye tracking her across the ballroom floor. Preston trailed behind, arms crossed, jaw tight, the evening slipping away from him faster than he could figure out how to reclaim it. Inside the small side room, Margaret examined the gown under better light, running her fingers along seams with the reverence of someone handling something sacred. "The stitching technique is unmistakable," she said half to herself. "This particular beading pattern, the way the bodice is structured. I've seen photographs of Mercer originals in old-fashioned archives. Only a handful were ever documented. Most were believed lost." "Lost how?" Addie asked. Margaret glanced up. "That," she said carefully, "is a very good question. From what I remember of the history, House of Mercer Couture closed abruptly, sometime in the early 90s. No public explanation was ever given. The designer simply disappeared from the industry overnight." Addie's throat tightened. "My grandmother had a stroke 2 years ago," she said quietly. "She can't speak anymore. She's never once mentioned any of this. Not the dress, not a fashion house, nothing." Margaret studied her for a long moment. "Then perhaps," she said gently, "it's time someone finally found out why." Addie looked down at the gown, seeing it suddenly in a different light. Not just a beautiful object. A question waiting 30 years for an answer. "Do you think she's still alive?" Margaret asked carefully. "Vivian Mercer, I mean. Sometimes designers like this simply retire quietly out of the public eye." "She's alive," Addie said. "She's my grandmother. I see her every single day." Margaret's expression shifted, something like disbelief settling in. "Then whatever she knows," Margaret said slowly, "she's the only one left who can tell us the whole truth. Everyone else involved may have every reason to keep it buried." Addie thought of Vivian's trembling hand. Not mine. Maybe her grandmother had been trying to tell her the truth all along. She just hadn't had the words left to finish the sentence. She turned to the gown again, examining it with fresh focus. Her fingers paused near the collar, tracing something small stitched into the fabric. 2 silver initials, embroidered so finely they were nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. "VM there," Margaret whispered. "That confirms it." She looked up at Addie, her expression somewhere between astonishment and disbelief. "Miss Mercer," she said slowly, "based on documented sales of comparable Mercer originals at auction, and accounting for provenance, condition, and rarity, a piece like this could be valued conservatively at $2 million, if authenticated fully." For a moment, nobody in the room said anything at all. Outside, faintly, Addie could hear the murmur of the crowd growing louder, word already spreading through the ballroom like wildfire through dry grass. $2 million. She thought of her grandmother, sitting alone in a small room at Brookhaven, unable to speak, unable to explain any of this. "Not mine," Vivian had tapped, slow and painful, days ago. Addie was beginning to understand. This had never been just a dress. Word moved through the ballroom faster than anyone could contain it. By the time Addie and Margaret returned to the main hall, the entire room had changed. Guests who'd ignored her an hour ago now watched with open curiosity. Whispers passed table to table. The number 2 million repeated so many times it seemed to hang in the air itself. Preston stood near the center of the room, jaw tight, watching his carefully planned joke unravel. Right in front of a Channel 9 camera crew that had moments ago been filming exactly what he wanted them to film. just not the way he'd wanted it. "This is absurd," he said loud enough for those nearby to hear. "A tailor shop employee? Showing up in a $2 million gown? Where exactly would someone like her get something like that?" "I already told you," Addie said, steady despite the eyes on her. "It belonged to my grandmother." "Convenient story," Preston shot back. Something in his voice had grown sharper, more desperate. "I think we should verify that, don't you? Before anyone gets carried away." Margaret stepped forward. "I'd be more than happy to provide formal documentation," she said calmly. "Provenance research takes time, but the craftsmanship alone is compelling evidence. Time we don't necessarily have," Preston said, glancing toward his father, who had just entered the ballroom, drawn by the commotion. Gerald Whitfield moved through the crowd with the measured calm of a man used to controlling every room he entered. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, carrying himself with the quiet authority of old money and older secrets. He stopped a few feet from Addie. His eyes moved slowly over the gown. Something crossed his face, brief, controlled, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. But Addie saw it, recognition. "Mr. Whitfield," Margaret said politely, "perhaps you could help settle the matter. Do you recognize the House of Mercer couture label?" Gerald's expression smoothed back into practiced neutrality. "I'm afraid I don't," he said, "but I'm certainly curious to learn more." His voice was calm. His hands, however, Addie noticed, were clenched slightly at his sides. Dorothy Hayes, still standing near the edge of the room, watched Gerald Whitfield's face with an intensity that suggested she, too, had noticed exactly what Addie had. He was lying. And whatever he was lying about, it had something to do with the names stitched so carefully into the collar of her grandmother's gown. Preston caught his father's sleeve near the terrace doors, pulling him a few steps away from the crowd. "You know something," Preston said quietly. "Don't tell me you don't. Lower your voice. Dad, the board is watching everything tonight. If there's something about this family they don't already know, now would be the time to tell me." Gerald's eyes swept and checking who was close enough to hear. "Not here," he said. "Not tonight. Then when?" "When I say so." Gerald's voice had gone hard, the way it did whenever a business deal turned uncomfortable. "Smile. Shake a few hands. Let this settle down on its own." Preston searched his father's face for something, anything, that might explain the sudden tightness around his eyes. He found nothing but a wall he'd never seen there before. "Fine," Preston said, "fine. But this isn't over." "No," Gerald said quietly, almost to himself, watching Addie across the room. "I don't imagine it is." The rest of the evening blurred into a haze of hushed conversations and careful, curious glances. Guests who had come to watch a joke unfold instead found themselves witnessing something they couldn't quite name yet. Something that felt bigger than a dress, bigger than a party. Preston kept his distance for the remainder of the night. Though Addie caught him watching her more than once from across the room, his expression unreadable, calculating. Near midnight, as the gala began winding down, Margaret found Addie by the coat check, offering her card. "I'll begin formal authentication first thing tomorrow," she said. "But between us, Miss Mercer, I don't think there's much doubt left. That gown is real, and so I suspect is whatever history it's connected to." "Thank you," Addie said quietly, "for believing me tonight." Margaret's expression softened. "I didn't just believe you," she said. "I believed the dress. Craftsmanship like that doesn't lie, even when the people around it do." Addie thought about those words the entire drive home. The gown folded carefully across the passenger seat, moonlight catching the beating through the car window like scattered stars. She thought about her grandmother's shaking hand. Not mine. Whatever secret Vivian Mercer had buried for 30 years, it was beginning to surface now, one thread at a time. And somewhere across town, in a house far grander than anything Addie had ever known, Gerald Whitfield sat alone in his study, staring at an old locked filing cabinet he hadn't opened in decades. The house was quiet. Preston had gone to bed hours ago, still convinced the worst of the night had already passed. Gerald knew better. He remembered his father sitting in this exact chair once, decades earlier, telling him a story had been buried so deep it would never surface again. His father had been wrong about a great many things. Gerald was beginning to suspect this would be one more. His hand shook as he reached for the key. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. He was starting to understand that tonight. So was everyone else in Ashworth Falls. Dorothy Hayes drove home slower than usual that night. She kept thinking about the dress, about the name Mercer, said out loud in a room full of people who'd spent 30 years pretending they'd never heard it before. She remembered the shop on Larch Street the way it used to be. The bell above the door, the young woman with pins between her lips, always smiling, even with a mouth full of steel. She remembered, too, exactly why that shop had gone quiet. She just hadn't said the words out loud in over 30 years. Parked in her driveway, engine still running, Dorothy sat a long moment in the dark. Somewhere out there, a granddaughter had just walked into a room wearing the truth, whether she understood it yet or not. Dorothy wasn't sure she was brave enough to help her carry it, but for the first time in decades, she wasn't sure she was brave enough not to either. News travels fast in a small town. It travels faster when the story involves money, scandal, and a family name stitched onto half the buildings downtown. By Sunday morning, the story of the gown had reached every corner of Ashworth Falls. The diner on 5th Street buzzed with it. The checkout line at the grocery store buzzed with it. Even the church parking lot buzzed with it, a place usually reserved for quiet nods and polite smiles. $2 million. A dress found in a locked trunk. A quiet girl nobody had ever noticed before, standing in the middle of the county's biggest party, wearing something worth more than most houses in town. At the diner, 2 waitresses argued over the details between orders. "I heard she stole it," one said, refilling a coffee cup. "I heard the opposite," the other shot back. "I heard the Whitfields owe her family something. Something big." Neither of them knew the full truth yet. Nobody in Ashworth Falls did. At a corner booth, an older man Addie had never met folded his newspaper and set it down, listening to the waitresses argue with the particular attention of someone who remembered more than he was letting on. He didn't say anything. Not yet. He simply finished his coffee, left a little extra on the table, and walked out into the Sunday morning sunlight, turning the name Mercer over in his mind for the first time in a long while. Addie stayed inside her apartment most of that day, curtains drawn, phone buzzing with numbers she didn't recognize. Reporters, most likely. She didn't answer. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table, the gown draped carefully over a chair beside her, and stared at the small stack of business cards she'd found in the trunk. Vivian Mercer, founder and head designer, House of Mercer Couture. A whole life her grandmother had never once mentioned. She thought about driving to Brookhaven that morning, but something held her back. Whatever truth was buried in that trunk, she wasn't sure her grandmother was ready to face it yet. She wasn't sure she was ready either. Margaret Voss didn't wait for Monday. She spent her Sunday buried in old-fashioned archives, dusty auction catalogs, and microfilm records from a defunct trade publication called Couture Weekly, tracking down every scrap of information she could find about a design house that had vanished decades ago. What she found made her sit back in her chair, stunned. House of Mercer Couture hadn't just been a small local business. In the late 80s, it had been considered one of the most promising design houses on the East Coast. Reviewed favorably in 3 major fashion publications, featured once briefly in a segment about emerging American designers. One old clipping described the young designer's work as quietly extraordinary, the kind of craftsmanship that made established names nervous. A second clipping, shorter, mentioned a spring showcase planned for 1991. Previewing 3 pieces, the writer called some of the most promising work to come out of the region in years. The showcase, as far as Margaret could tell from the archives, had never actually happened. And then, in the spring of 1991, it simply stopped existing. No public announcement, no closing sale, no farewell interview. 1 month, House of Mercer Couture was preparing for a spring showcase. The next month, it was gone. Vivian Mercer's name disappeared from the fashion world entirely. Owen stopped by Addie's apartment Tuesday morning, a paper bag of groceries in one arm. "Figured you might not be eating much," he said, setting the bag on her counter.
Can't fight a Whitfield on an empty stomach.
"I'm not fighting anyone," Addie said. "I'm just trying to understand what happened to my grandmother." "Same thing where that family's concerned," Owen said. "You start pulling one thread, you find out the whole coat was stitched crooked from the start." He glanced at the gown, still draped over the chair. "You going to see her today?" Addie nodded. "I don't know what to say to her yet." "Then don't say anything," Owen said. "Just sit with her. Sometimes that's worth more than the right words anyway." Addie nodded, gathering her jacket from the back of a chair. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Have you ever heard anyone talk about a fashion house that used to be in this building? Before you bought it? Owen thought about it a long moment, brow furrowed. Once or twice maybe, he said slowly. Old-timers mentioning something pretty that used to be on this corner. Never anything specific. People around here have a way of remembering the feeling of a thing long after they've forgotten the facts. That's strange, isn't it? Addie said. A whole business gone and nobody remembers the name. Not strange, Owen said. Convenient. For somebody, anyway. Addie visited Vivian that afternoon, exactly as Owen suggested. She didn't bring up the gala. She didn't ask any more questions. She simply held her grandmother's hand and let the silence between them mean whatever it needed to mean. Vivian squeezed her hand once, gently, before she left. It felt, for the first time in days, like enough. Margaret found something else buried in an old business registry, something that made her sit very still for a long moment. A filing from 1991, transferring the assets of a business called Mercer Design Group into a newly formed entity, the Whitfield Charitable Foundation. Margaret read the filing 3 times, making sure she hadn't misunderstood. She hadn't. The foundation had spent over 3 decades raising money in the Whitfield name. It funded half the elder care programs in Ashworth Falls. It had been built, at least in part, on the bones of something that once belonged to someone else. To Vivian Mercer. Margaret sat back in her chair, the old clipping still in her hand, and thought about the young woman she'd met just hours earlier. A woman who had no idea her grandmother's entire life's work had quietly funded the very foundation now threatening to discredit her. Monday morning, Preston sat across from his father in the study of the Whitfield estate, a room lined with leather-bound books nobody in the family had ever actually read. Gerald hadn't slept. Anyone could see it. The shadows under his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand shook slightly around his coffee cup. The board is asking questions, Preston said, pacing near the window. Reporters are asking questions. This was supposed to be a joke, not a headline. I'm aware, Gerald said quietly. You knew that name, Preston said, stopping mid-stride. Saturday night, when that woman said Mercer Couture, I saw your face. You knew exactly what she was talking about. Gerald set down his coffee cup, his hand steadier now, his expression carefully arranged. You need to let this go, he said. Whatever happened decades ago has nothing to do with you or this family's future. It has everything to do with our future, Preston snapped. The board meets Friday night. They're voting on whether to finalize the asset transfer into the new investment trust. If this scandal isn't handled by then, they'll delay the vote. Maybe cancel it entirely. Maybe replace me before I even get the chance to sit in that chair. Gerald's jaw tightened. Then handle it, he said, quietly. How exactly do you suggest I do that? Gerald stood, moving to the window, staring out at the perfectly manicured lawn beyond the glass. Discredit the girl, he said finally, his voice flat. Question the dress. Question her story. Make people doubt what they saw Saturday night before that appraiser finishes her research. And if she's right, Preston asked. If the dress really is what she says it is. Gerald turned, and for just a moment, something shifted behind his eyes. Something that looked almost like fear. Then we make sure nobody believes her long enough for it to matter, he said quietly. That's it? That's the whole plan? Preston pressed. Discredit a girl who's done nothing but wear a dress her own grandmother left her? Gerald's expression hardened. You didn't seem to have any objections to discrediting her when you invited her to that gala in the first place. Preston had no answer for that. Preston studied his father, a question forming that he didn't quite have the nerve to ask. What exactly happened decades ago? He let it go. There would be time for that question later. Right now, he had a board meeting to save and a girl to discredit. He didn't notice, as he left the study, the way his father's hand lingered on the edge of the desk, or the way Gerald exhaled once the door closed, like a man who had just bought himself a little more time he didn't actually deserve. Alone now, Gerald crossed to the window, watching Preston's car pull out of the driveway. He thought about his own father, gone now almost 20 years, sitting in this same room, explaining a business decision Gerald had been too young and too comfortable to question. Charles Whitfield had always called it an opportunity, a shrewd investment, a fair trade for a struggling young designer who needed capital she couldn't get anywhere else. Gerald had believed that story for most of his life. It was only much later, sorting through his father's private papers after the funeral, that he'd found something that didn't quite match the story he'd always been told. He'd buried that discovery the same way his father had buried everything else. Quietly, carefully, without ever looking at it directly again. Standing at the window now, 30 years later, he wondered how long a person could keep doing that before the weight of it finally became too much to carry. Dorothy Hayes hadn't slept well since Saturday night either. She was 78 years old, and she'd lived in Ashworth Falls her entire life. She remembered things most people in this town had long since forgotten. She remembered a small shop on Larch Street decades ago, before it became a tailor shop. Back when it belonged to a young woman with brilliant hands and even more brilliant dreams. Vivian Mercer. Dorothy had bought a dress from her once, for her daughter's wedding. She still remembered how it felt to wear something made just for her, stitched with care she'd never experienced before or since. She remembered the fitting itself, the way Vivian had knelt on the floor with pins between her lips, adjusting the hem a fraction of an inch at a time, until it fell exactly right. She remembered Vivian laughing at something Dorothy's daughter had said, the sound of it warm and unhurried like a woman who genuinely loved the work in front of her. She remembered, too, the year it all disappeared. The whispers, the sudden closure, the way people simply stopped mentioning Vivian's name, as though speaking it might invite trouble to their own doorstep. Dorothy had never fully understood why. She'd been younger then, more concerned with her own family than town gossip, but she remembered the fear in people's eyes whenever the subject came up. Fear of the Whitfield family. Her late husband had worked briefly for one of Charles Whitfield's businesses, decades ago, back before Dorothy's daughter was even born. She remembered him coming home one evening, unusually quiet, refusing to talk about his day. She'd asked him once what was wrong. Some things, he'd told her, you keep to yourself if you want to keep your paycheck. She'd never pushed him further. Sitting in her small apartment at Brookhaven now, just 2 doors down from Vivian Mercer's own room, Dorothy stared at her phone, debating whether to call the local news station. She had information, old memories, maybe useful ones. But she also had something else to consider. Her medical assistance, her subsidized rent, the small precarious stability that kept a roof over her head in her final years, a stability quietly funded, in part, by the very foundation carrying the Whitfield name. She set the phone down without dialing. Not yet, she told herself. Not until she understood exactly what she'd be risking and for whom. Her daughter called that evening, as she did every Tuesday. "You sound distracted, Mom," her daughter said. "Everything all right?" Dorothy considered telling her everything. The shop, the dress, the name she'd kept locked away for over 30 years. "There's a young woman in town," Dorothy said instead. "Reminds me of somebody I used to know. I'm trying to decide if I owe her something." "Owe her what?" "The truth," Dorothy said quietly. "Even when it's inconvenient." Her daughter was silent a moment. "You've always taught me that silence protects people. Isn't that what you always told me growing up?" "I did," Dorothy admitted. "I'm starting to wonder if I had that backwards." After they hung up, Dorothy sat with her cup of tea long after it had gone cold. She thought about the young designer she'd once known. She thought about the granddaughter, who now needed someone brave enough to remember her. Margaret called Addie Monday afternoon, her voice tight with something between excitement and concern. "I found something," she said. "You need to see this in person." They met at Margaret's small office downtown, tucked above an antique shop, walls lined with framed photographs of vintage gowns Margaret had authenticated over the years. She spread documents across her desk, old registry filings, photocopied newspaper clippings, a single black and white photograph of a young woman standing beside a mannequin, pins between her lips, a half-finished gown taking shape beneath her hands. Addie stared at the photograph, breath-catching. "That's her," she whispered. "That's my grandmother." Margaret nodded gently. "Taken in 1989, according to the archive notes. 2 years before House of Mercer Couture closed." "What happened to it?" Addie asked. "Why did it close?" Margaret hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I found a business filing from 1991, she said. "It shows the assets of Vivian's design company being transferred into a newly formed charitable entity." She turned the paper around so Addie could read it herself. "The Whitfield Charitable Foundation." Addie's stomach dropped. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that the foundation running this town's biggest charity gala, the one Preston Whitfield runs, was built using my grandmother's company?" "I'm telling you," Margaret said carefully that the paperwork suggests exactly that, though paperwork alone doesn't tell us how or why or whether it was done legally. Addie picked up the old photograph again, studying her grandmother's young face. She never once complained, Addie said quietly. Not in 24 years. Not a single word about any of this. Some people carry their losses quietly, Margaret said. It doesn't mean the loss wasn't enormous. Addie thought about all the small habits she'd never questioned. The way Vivian folded fabric with unusual precision, even scraps destined for the trash. The way she'd once corrected, without a word, the uneven stitching on a coat Addie brought home from a thrift store, simply taking it apart and redoing it while Addie slept. She'd always assumed that was just who her grandmother was. Now she understood it was who her grandmother had trained herself to be, out of a skill nobody in this town had ever properly honored. Addie thought about her grandmother's small room at Brookhaven. The plastic board. The two words tapped out with so much effort. Not mine. Maybe silence had never meant surrender. Maybe it had simply meant waiting for someone strong enough to finally ask the right questions. Margaret spent Wednesday morning on the phone with a contact at the State Archive office, requesting certified copies of the original 1991 filing. These older records take time, the archivist told her. Sometimes a week, sometimes longer if the file's been flagged for any reason. Flagged how? Restricted access, usually. Legal holds.
That sort of thing?
Margaret frowned at the phone. Is this one flagged? A pause. Keys, clicking on the other end of the line. That's strange, the archivist said slowly. According to this, someone requested a copy of this exact file 8 years ago. Never picked it up. Do you have a name on that request? I can look. Give me a moment. Margaret waited, pen hovering over a fresh legal pad, until the archivist came back with an answer that made her sit up straight in her chair. Gerald Whitfield, the archivist said, requested it himself. 8 years ago. Margaret thanked her and hung up slowly, staring at the name she'd just written down. Whatever Gerald Whitfield had been hiding, he'd apparently known exactly where the evidence was buried. He simply hadn't counted on anyone else going looking for it. Margaret spent the rest of that Wednesday cross-referencing old newspaper microfilm, searching for any mention of the design house's closure in the local paper's archives. She found almost nothing. A single classified ad, buried on a back page, announcing studio space available on Larch Street. No explanation given. 30 years of silence condensed into 11 quiet words in a classified section nobody had thought to question since. It struck her, staring at that faded advertisement, just how thoroughly a story could be erased if enough powerful people simply agreed not to tell it. Franklin Reyes, chairman of the foundation's board, spent that same Wednesday evening at his kitchen table, reviewing the agenda for Friday's vote with a growing unease he couldn't quite name. He'd served on this board for over 2 decades. He'd known Charles Whitfield personally, back when the foundation was young and its finances simpler. He remembered vaguely a small design business folding around the same time the foundation's assets had grown unusually quickly. He'd never thought much of it at the time. Business was business, and Charles had always seemed generous enough with the town. Now, watching the news coverage build night after night, that old memory nagged at him in a way it never had before. He picked up his phone and called an old friend, another longtime board member, just to ask a simple question. "Do you remember," he asked, "anything about how this foundation actually got started?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Funny you should ask," his friend said. "I've been wondering the exact same thing all week." Franklin hung up the phone that night with a knot in his stomach he couldn't quite untangle. He'd spent 20 years trusting the Whitfield name without ever once asking it to show its work. He decided, sitting alone at his kitchen table, that Friday's vote deserved a harder look than he'd originally planned to give it. By Wednesday, the story had grown beyond Ashworth Falls. A regional news outlet picked it up, running a segment titled "Mystery Gown Sparks Questions About Local Charities' Origins." Channel 9, eager not to be outdone by their own earlier footage, scheduled a follow-up broadcast, live from the foundation's downtown office, timed deliberately before Friday's board vote. Preston saw an opportunity. If he could control the narrative before the cameras rolled, he could turn Addie's story into a scandal of her own making. That would buy him enough time to save both the vote and his own position. He arranged for the broadcast to happen at the foundation's downtown office, insisting on a public statement to, as he put it, Set the record straight. Addie received a call inviting her to attend, framed carefully as an opportunity to clear up any confusion. She should have said no, but she thought of her grandmother, of the photograph, of 30 years of silence that deserved finally to be broken. She said yes. Margaret tried to talk her out of going alone. "Let me come with you," she said. "At the very least, bring documentation. If they want to challenge this publicly, we should be ready to answer publicly." "I have your card," Addie said, "and the photograph." "That's not enough, and you know it." Addie managed a tired smile. "It's what I've got." At the Channel 9 studio that afternoon, a young producer named Rosa Delgado reviewed the footage from Saturday night one more time before the live broadcast. "This story's bigger than a gown," she told her news director. "Something about a missing fashion house. A foundation that won't answer questions. I think we should be asking harder ones tonight." "Whitfield's people specifically requested a friendly segment," her director said. "They're a major advertiser." "They're also maybe covering up 30 years of something," Rosa said. "I'd rather ask the hard question and let the audience decide, instead of just handing Preston Whitfield a stage." Her director hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Fine," he said. "Ask your questions. Just don't editorialize on air." Rosa didn't plan to. She simply planned to point a camera at the truth and let it speak for itself. At the diner on 5th Street, the broadcast played on the small television mounted above the counter. A handful of regulars had gathered by the time Preston stepped up to the podium on screen, coffee cups forgotten, watching in near silence. When Dorothy Hayes appeared, cane in hand, voice trembling but unbroken, the room went completely still. "That's Dorothy," one older man said quietly. "Haven't heard her raise her voice like that in 20 years. "Good for her," the waitress muttered, refilling nobody's cup, too caught up in the screen to notice. By the time the segment ended, several regulars were already reaching for their phones, calling neighbors, calling family, telling them to turn on the news. Whatever this story turned out to be, Ashworth Falls was no longer content to simply whisper about it in checkout lines. They were starting to pay attention, really pay attention. For the first time in a long while, the foundation's downtown office buzzed with activity Thursday evening. Reporters set up cameras near a small podium. Board members mingled nervously near the back of the room, unsure what exactly they were about to witness. Preston stood near the front, dressed impeccably, practicing calm, even though his pulse hammered beneath his collar. Addie arrived with Margaret at her side, the gown left safely at home this time, though its presence seemed to hang in the room regardless. Preston stepped up to the podium first, addressing the small crowd with practiced ease. "Thank you all for coming," he said smoothly. "In light of recent, frankly bizarre claims circulating about our family's foundation, I felt it important to address the matter directly and honestly." He paused, letting the cameras find their focus. "3 days ago," he continued, "a young woman named Addie Mercer arrived at our charity gala wearing a gown she claims belonged to her grandmother. A gown some are now speculating is worth millions of dollars, and somehow connected to this foundation's history." He shook his head slowly, a picture of patient disappointment. "I want to be clear. We take our foundation's integrity very seriously. And frankly, I find it troubling that unverified claims from someone with no documented connection to this organization are being treated as fact." He turned, gesturing toward Addie. "In fact," he said, voice hardening, "I've since learned some troubling details suggesting this gown may not have been legitimately obtained at all." Addie felt the room shift around her, eyes turning in her direction. "I don't understand," she said. "The gown belonged to my grandmother. I have photographs. I have documentation, do you?" Preston asked, tilting his head. "Because according to sources close to this investigation, that gown may have been reported missing decades ago. Stolen property, resurfacing conveniently now, worn by someone claiming a connection that, so far, remains entirely unproven." Gasps rippled through the small crowd. A reporter near the front called out before Margaret could respond. "Mr. Whitfield, can you name these sources? Is there an actual police report on file anywhere?" Preston hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long. "That information is confidential," he said, "for obvious reasons. Or it doesn't exist," the reporter pressed. Preston ignored the follow-up entirely, turning back toward Addie instead. Margaret stepped forward immediately. "That's a serious accusation," she said sharply. "One with absolutely no basis in the research I've conducted." "Then perhaps," Preston said smoothly, Your research is incomplete. He nodded toward two men standing near the door, uniformed security from the country club, moving through the crowd toward Addie. I think it's best, Preston said, voice calm and cold, if Miss Mercer is escorted out while this matter is properly investigated. For everyone's protection, Addie's heart pounded as the security guards approached, their expressions unreadable, following orders they clearly hadn't questioned. This is ridiculous, Margaret said, stepping between them. You cannot simply accuse someone of theft with no evidence and have her removed like a criminal. I have every right, Preston said, to protect this foundation's reputation from unsubstantiated claims. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second. Addie felt her face burn, humiliation and anger tangled together, but she forced herself to stand still, to breathe, to remember what her grandmother had taught her without ever needing words. Dignity wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I'm not going anywhere, she said quietly, her voice steady despite everything. I haven't done anything wrong, one of the guards said, reaching for her arm. We need you to come with us. Don't touch her. The voice came from the back of the room, sharp and unexpected. Every head turned. Dorothy Hayes stood near the doorway, her cane shaking slightly in her grip, her eyes fixed directly on Preston with an intensity nobody in the room had seen from her before. I knew Vivian Mercer, Dorothy said, voice unsteady but clear. I bought a dress from her 35 years ago. I remember her shop. I remember her name being erased from this town like it never mattered at all. Preston's composure faltered, just slightly. Mrs. Hayes, he said carefully, I understand emotions are running high, but this isn't the place. I'm not finished. Dorothy interrupted, stepping further into the room. I've stayed quiet for a long time. Too long, maybe. But I will not stand here and watch you humiliate an innocent young woman the same way this town let you humiliate her grandmother decades ago. The room had gone completely silent, save for the quiet whir of camera equipment, capturing every word. Preston's eyes flicked toward his father, standing near the back of the room, face pale, unreadable. For the first time since the scheme began, Preston looked genuinely uncertain. A reporter near the front raised her hand. Mr. Whitfield, if Mrs. Hayes' account is accurate, does the foundation have any record of a woman named Vivian Mercer? I'd have to check our archives, Preston said, buying time. And will you? Another reporter pressed. Tonight? Before the vote? Preston glanced toward his father, who offered no help at all, his gaze fixed somewhere past the cameras. One of the older board members, a woman named Constance Ridley, had served on the foundation for nearly 15 years. She leaned toward the man beside her, murmuring just loud enough for those nearby to catch. I don't like how quiet Gerald's gone, she said. Man's never quiet unless he's hiding something. The guards hesitated, glancing toward Preston for direction, unsure whether Dorothy's outburst changed anything. Preston recovered quickly, forcing calm back into his voice. Mrs. Hayes, he said, your memories, while touching, don't constitute legal proof of anything. I'm afraid we still need to resolve the question of this gown's origins properly. He nodded again toward the guards. They moved forward, and this time nobody stopped them. Addie felt a hand close around her arm, firm despite the guard's obvious discomfort with the entire situation. She found herself being guided toward the door as reporters shouted questions and camera flashes exploded around her. Miss Mercer, do you deny the theft allegations? Is it true the gown was reported missing decades ago? Can you comment on the Whitfield Foundation's history? Addie kept her chin up, refusing to let the tears building behind her eyes fall in front of the cameras. Margaret hurried after her, furious. This isn't over, she called out. I have documentation. Legitimate provenance research. You cannot simply erase facts because they're inconvenient. Then produce your evidence, Preston said calmly from the podium, projecting confidence he no longer entirely felt. Formally, through proper channels. Until then, this foundation has every right to protect itself from unverified claims. Addie was escorted out into the cool evening air, the office door closing firmly behind her, muffling the chaos still unfolding inside. She stood on the sidewalk, shaking, humiliated, but not broken. Margaret joined her moments later, breathless. Where's your certificate of authentication? Addie asked quietly. The one you drafted Sunday night. Margaret's face went pale. I emailed a copy to the foundation's board this morning, she said slowly, as a courtesy before tonight's broadcast. I wanted them to have accurate information before making a public statement. And? Margaret pulled out her phone, fingers moving quickly across the screen, searching. Her expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "It's gone," she whispered. "The email. It's just gone. Deleted from my sent folder. I don't understand how that's even possible." Addie felt something cold settle in her chest. Someone had erased the evidence. And whoever it was, they had access to systems neither she nor Margaret fully understood. "I'll call the board's IT contact first thing tomorrow," Margaret said. Though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence, someone can restore a deleted email. There has to be a record somewhere. And if there isn't? Addie asked. Margaret didn't have an answer for that. They sat together on a bench outside the office for a long moment, both of them too rattled to drive just yet. "I still have the photographs," Margaret finally said. "The physical documents. Nobody can delete those with a keystroke."
Is it enough?
Against a family with this much reach? Margaret shook her head slowly. "Honestly, I don't know. We need something they can't argue with. Something that doesn't depend on my professional opinion alone." "Like what?" "Like a person who was actually there," Margaret said. "Someone who watched it happen firsthand and still has the paperwork to prove it." Addie thought of the name in her grandmother's old address book. She hadn't mentioned it to Margaret yet. She wasn't sure why she was suddenly certain it mattered more than anything else they'd found so far. Owen found Addie still standing outside 20 minutes later, having seen the broadcast from his own living room and driven straight over without stopping to change out of his slippers. "I saw," he said, before she could even explain. "The whole town saw." "I didn't steal anything," Addie said, her voice cracking for the first time all night. "I know that," Owen said firmly. "Anybody with sense knows that. That family's just never had to answer for anything in their whole lives, and it shows." He put a steady hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this," he said. "Whatever happens next, you've got people in your corner. More than you probably realize." Addie let herself lean into that steadiness for a moment, grateful for it in a way she didn't have words for yet. That night, Addie sat alone in her apartment, replaying the evening over and over in her mind. The accusations, the cameras, Dorothy's shaking but fierce defense. She thought about calling the police herself, filing some kind of report. But what would she even say? That a missing email proved a conspiracy? That a locked trunk and a fading photograph were enough to fight a family whose name was etched into half the town? She felt, for the first time since finding the gown, truly and completely alone. She thought about calling her mother and dismissed the idea almost as quickly as it came. Her mother had never once asked about Vivian's health without also asking, somewhere in the same breath, whether there was any money involved. Addie didn't have the strength tonight to have that conversation twice in 1 week. She thought about Owen, asleep by now most likely, and decided the morning would have to be soon enough for him. She thought, finally, about her grandmother, alone in a small room, unable to even pick up a phone to check on her. Then she remembered something. A conversation with her grandmother months ago, before the stroke had taken her voice entirely. A quiet afternoon, Vivian sorting through an old shoebox of papers, mentioning almost offhandedly a name Addie hadn't thought about since. "If anything ever happens," Vivian had said, her voice already beginning to weaken by then, "and you don't know what to do, call Walter Sullivan. He'll know what I mean." At the time, Addie had assumed it was nothing. An old friend, perhaps. A distant memory from a life she knew little about. She thought about the drive home from the foundation office, the streets of Ashworth Falls passing by dark and unfamiliar, even though she'd lived here 2 years now. She'd passed the country club on the way, lights still blazing inside, though the gala had ended days ago. Somewhere in that building, people who had never once had to fight for anything were deciding her grandmother's fate without her in the room. She'd passed the tailor shop too, dark and quiet, Owen's porch light the only glow on the block. And she'd passed Brookhaven, slowing without meaning to. She stared up at the window she knew belonged to her grandmother's room. She wondered if Vivian was watching the same night sky, carrying the same impossible weight. Now, sitting in the dark, exhausted and afraid, those words felt like the only lifeline she had left. She found an old address book among her grandmother's belongings, flipping through yellowed pages until she found the name, written in careful, elegant handwriting. Walter Sullivan, attorney at law. A phone number, decades old, sat beside it. She had no idea if it would even still work. But it was Thursday night. The board would vote Friday, at midnight, deciding the fate of a fortune quietly built on her grandmother's stolen legacy. She didn't have time to wonder. She dialed the number. Across town, in a quiet room at Brookhaven Senior Residence, Vivian Mercer sat upright in her bed, eyes fixed on a small television mounted in the corner. The evening news played, replaying footage from earlier that evening. Addie's face caught mid-sentence, security guards closing in around her. Vivian's hand shook against the blanket. A nurse passing by paused in the doorway, noticing the older woman's obvious distress. "Mrs. Mercer, are you all right?" Vivian didn't look away from the screen. Her hand moved, slow but deliberate, toward the plastic board resting on her lap, fingers unsteady with effort as she tapped out a single word, over and over to "peep." The nurse frowned, unsure what she meant. Vivian tapped again, harder this time, frustration and fear breaking through decades of careful, practiced calm. "ST." Her eyes filled with tears as the television replayed the moment security guards took hold of her granddaughter's arm. 30 years of silence pressed against her chest like a physical weight. She had buried this story so deep for so long, believing it was the only way to keep her family safe. Watching Addie on that screen, she understood, with sudden and terrible clarity, that her silence hadn't protected anyone. It had only given the Whitfield family 30 more years to bury the truth even deeper. Vivian's hand curled into a fist against the blanket. The nurse, sensing something urgent in the old woman's eyes, sat down beside the bed. "Do you need something, Mrs. Mercer? Do you want me to call someone?" Vivian's hand moved again, slower now, exhausted, but determined. "CLLADIE," the nurse's eyebrows lifted. "You want me to call your granddaughter?" Vivian nodded once firmly, tears still on her cheeks. The nurse hesitated at the door. "It's after 10, Mrs. Mercer. Are you certain it can't wait until morning?" Vivian's hand moved once more, slow but unmistakable. "NOW." The nurse didn't argue further. She stepped out to find a phone, leaving Vivian alone with the television still playing, her granddaughter's face frozen mid-protest on the screen. Vivian looked at that frozen image a long moment, memorizing it, letting it settle into something harder than grief. For the first time in 2 years, she wasn't just listening. She was preparing to fight. The phone rang twice before a tired, gravelly voice answered. "Hello?" Addie's breath caught. "Is this Walter Sullivan?" A pause. "Depends who's asking." "My name is Addie Mercer," she said, voice trembling slightly. "Vivian Mercer is my grandmother. She told me, a long time ago, that if anything ever happened, I should call you." Silence stretched across the line, long enough that Addie wondered if he'd hung up. Then finally, the old man spoke again, his voice quieter now, heavier. "I always wondered," he said slowly, "if this day would come. Mr. Sullivan, I don't understand what's happening. There's a gown, a fashion house my grandmother apparently ran decades ago, and now the Whitfield Foundation is accusing me of theft. And evidence keeps disappearing, and I don't know who else to trust." Walter Sullivan let out a long, tired breath. "I've been waiting 30 years for someone to ask me the right questions," he said. "I kept a copy of everything, Miss Mercer. Everything the Whitfield family hoped the world would forget." Addie's heart pounded. "Can you help me?" "I can do better than that," Walter said, a note of steel entering his voice for the first time. "I can prove exactly what they did to your grandmother, and exactly why they've been so desperate to keep it buried." "Why did you keep everything?" Addie asked. "For 30 years?" Walter was quiet a moment. "Because your grandmother once told me something I never forgot," he said. "She said the truth doesn't expire just because everyone stops talking about it. She asked me to hold on to it, in case a day like this ever came. She knew this might happen. She hoped it wouldn't have to," Walter said, "but she was never a woman who left things to chance if she could help it." Addie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said, "for picking up the phone tonight." "Thank your grandmother," Walter said. "She's the one who made sure I still had a working number, all these years later. Sent me a card every Christmas, regular as clockwork, just so I'd never lose track of her." Addie hadn't known that either. There was so much she was realizing that she hadn't known. "There's a board vote," Addie said quickly. "Tomorrow night. Midnight. They're finalizing some kind of asset transfer." Walter was quiet for a moment. "Then I suggest," he said finally, "you and I meet first thing in the morning. Because if what you're telling me is true, we don't have a moment to waste." Addie closed her eyes, relief and fear tangled together in her chest. "There's one more thing," she said. "My grandmother had a stroke 2 years ago. She can't speak anymore. If we need her to confirm any of this, I don't know how that's even possible." Walter was quiet for a long moment. "Your grandmother," he said finally, "was always the most resourceful person I ever knew. I imagine she's found a way to make herself understood." She usually did. For the first time since Saturday night, Addie didn't feel completely alone. Somewhere out there, an old man with an old briefcase held the truth her grandmother had carried in silence for 30 years. Tomorrow, finally, that silence would begin to break. Across town, Preston sat alone in his car outside the country club, long after everyone else had gone home. He kept replaying Dorothy Hayes's voice in his head, the certainty in it, the absence of any fear at all, even as security moved toward the young woman she was defending. He'd built his entire life on being the person everyone deferred to. Tonight, for the first time, an old woman with a cane had looked at him like he was the one who ought to be ashamed. He didn't like how that feeling sat in his chest. He thought about calling his father, asking him directly what exactly had happened all those years ago. But he already suspected he wouldn't get a straight answer even now. He told himself it didn't matter, that the board vote would settle everything by midnight tomorrow, and this whole mess would fade the way every scandal eventually did. But some small, unfamiliar part of him kept circling back to a single question he couldn't quite silence. What if his father really had done something unforgivable? And what if Preston had spent his entire life benefiting from it without ever once asking? He started the car and drove home in silence, the question following him the whole way. Ashworth Falls slept on around him, unaware that by tomorrow night, everything it thought it knew about its most trusted family would begin to unravel. Walter Sullivan's office smelled like old paper and older regret. Addie arrived just after 8 in the morning, Margaret beside her, both of them running on almost no sleep. The office sat above a shuttered hardware store. One room, cluttered with filing cabinets that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Walter met them at the door. He was somewhere past 80. Thin as a fence post, with sharp eyes that hadn't dulled with age. A cane rested against his desk, though he moved without it, slow but certain, like a man who'd made peace with time a long while ago. "You look just like her," he said, studying Addie's face. "Same eyes, same stubborn chin." "You knew my grandmother well," Addie said. "I was her lawyer," Walter said, "back when she still had a business worth protecting, before certain people decided that business belonged to them instead." He gestured toward 2 chairs, then moved to a filing cabinet in the corner, running his fingers along a row of folders until he found the one he wanted. He set it on the desk between them. 30 years of dust settled off the cover as he opened it. "Sit down," he said quietly. "This is going to take a while, and once I start talking, there's no putting this back in the drawer." Addie sat, glancing once at Margaret, who gave her a small, steadying nod. The office walls were lined with framed photographs, decades of them, mostly of Walter shaking hands at town events, ribbon cuttings, retirement dinners. In one corner, half hidden behind a taller frame, hung a single photograph that caught Addie's eye. A much younger Walter, standing beside a young woman in front of a shop window, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. She recognized the woman immediately. Walter noticed her looking. 1988, he said quietly before she could ask. The year her shop first opened its doors properly. I helped her file the paperwork, never charged her a dime for it. Best legal work I ever did, and the only payment I ever wanted was watching that place succeed. I've waited a long time to say any of this out loud, Walter said. Forgive me if I don't say it quickly. He poured 3 cups of coffee from a pot that had clearly been sitting there since early morning, sliding 2 across the desk. Your grandmother and I were friends before we were client and lawyer, he said. She used to bring me scraps of fabric when I was a young attorney, just starting out, barely able to afford a decent suit. Told me a man should always look like he believes in himself, even before anyone else does. Addie smiled faintly despite everything. That sounds like her. She was the most stubborn person I ever represented, Walter said, in the best possible way. When Charles Whitfield's lawyers tried to intimidate her into silence, she sat across from 3 of them in a conference room twice this size, and never once raised her voice. I remember thinking, watching her that day, that I'd never seen courage look quite so quiet before. What did she say to them? Walter's eyes crinkled with the memory. She told them a signature only means something if both people meant the same thing by it. Then she asked them to leave. Did they? Eventually, Walter said, after they'd made it very clear what continuing to fight would cost her. In 1989, Walter began, "Your grandmother ran the finest design house this town had ever seen, not just locally admired, nationally noticed. She had buyers coming from New York, magazine editors requesting private showings." He slid a photograph across the desk. Vivian, younger, radiant, standing beside a rack of finished gowns, pins between her lips, exhaustion and pride mixed together on her face. She needed capital to expand, Walter continued. More staff. She approached several investors. Most turned her down. Small design houses were considered risky. Except one, Addie guessed. Walter nodded slowly. Except one, Gerald Whitfield's father, Charles Whitfield. He offered to invest, structured as a partnership. 50% ownership split, on paper, in exchange for funding her expansion. That sounds reasonable, Margaret said cautiously. It would have been, Walter said, if the contract he had her sign matched the terms they'd actually agreed to. He pulled a second document from the folder, yellowed with age, and turned it around so they could read it. "This is the original agreement your grandmother believed she signed," he said. 50% partnership. Full creative control retained by Vivian. Profit sharing based on annual growth. He pulled a third document. "And this," he said, voice hardening, "is the version filed with the county 3 months later. 90% ownership transferred to Charles Whitfield. Full operational control. Vivian reduced to a salaried employee within her own company." Addie stared at the two documents, nearly identical, except for terms that changed everything. "How is that possible?" she whispered. "How do two different contracts exist?" Walter's jaw tightened because somewhere between the signing and the filing, he said, someone replaced pages. Vivian's signature is real. It's genuine, taken from the original document, but the terms surrounding it were altered before it ever reached the county recorder's office. "That's fraud," Margaret said sharply. "It's exactly that," Walter agreed. "But proving it, decades ago, against a family with the Whitfield name behind them, wasn't something a small-town lawyer with limited resources could accomplish alone." "What happened?" Addie asked. "When my grandmother found out." Walter's expression darkened, memory clearly still painful even after all these years. "She fought," he said simply, "for almost a year. But Charles Whitfield had resources she didn't. Lawyers, connections. He made it clear, through channels never quite explicit enough to prosecute, that continuing to fight would cost her more than the business was worth." "Cost her how?" Walter hesitated. "Her reputation, her ability to work anywhere in this state again, and eventually, veiled threats about her family's safety, delivered carefully enough that nothing could ever be traced back to him directly. Addie felt sick, so she gave up." "She survived," Walter corrected gently. "There's a difference. She signed away her remaining claim, took a settlement just large enough to start over quietly, and made me promise never to speak of any of it again. Not unless she gave the word herself." "And she never did," Addie said. "Not until now." Walter closed the folder slowly. "I kept everything," he said, "every document, every draft, waiting, I suppose, for a day when someone finally had the courage to ask." He looked up, meeting Addie's eyes. "You have that courage," he said. "The question now is whether we have enough time left to use it." The board meeting was scheduled for that night. Midnight, sharp, inside the country club's private conference room, where the Whitfield Foundation's board would formally vote to transfer all remaining assets into a newly created investment trust, effectively erasing decades of financial history behind layers of new paperwork. Once that vote passed, Walter explained grimly, proving anything would become exponentially harder. Assets would scatter across new accounts, new entities, buried under legal complexity designed specifically to discourage exactly the kind of investigation they were now racing to complete. "We have less than 16 hours, Walter said, checking his watch. "I need to authenticate these documents properly. Cross-reference county records. Confirm the signatures. This isn't something we can rush." "Then we won't rush it," Addie said. "We'll just work faster." Walter allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Your grandmother used to say something very similar," he said. "Right before she'd stay up 3 nights straight finishing a gown ahead of schedule." He gathered the folder, motioning them toward the door. "First stop," he said, "the county records office. I need the original filing, the one they think nobody bothered to keep a copy of." You have a copy? Margaret asked. Walter's smile turned sharper, almost mischievous, despite his exhaustion. I told you, he said. I kept everything. I just never had a reason to use it. Until today. The county records office smelled like old ink and older air conditioning, a building most residents of Ashworth Falls only visited once or twice in a lifetime. The clerk behind the counter, a woman who had clearly worked there longer than Addie had been alive, raised an eyebrow when Walter requested the original 1989 filing. That's an old one, she said. Might take some digging in the archive room. You sure you want the original, and not just a photocopy from the digital system? The original, Walter confirmed. The digital system only has what someone chose to scan. I need to see the paper itself. The clerk disappeared into a back room for nearly 20 minutes, long enough that Addie began to worry the file might not exist at all. When she returned, she carried a thin folder, slightly yellowed. Handling it with the practiced care of someone who understood old paper was fragile in ways people sometimes weren't. Here you go, she said. Can't recall the last time anyone asked for this one. Walter opened it carefully at the counter, comparing it page by page against the copy in his own folder. His hands, Addie noticed, had gone very still. It matches, he said quietly. Every discrepancy I remembered, right where I left it 30 years ago. While Walter and Margaret worked through documents at the records office, Addie drove straight to Brookhaven. She needed to see her grandmother. She needed, more than anything, to understand why decades of silence had felt safer than the truth. Vivian was sitting upright when Addie arrived, alert in a way she hadn't been in months, eyes sharp and focused the moment the door opened. Grandma, Addie said softly, crossing the room, kneeling beside the bed. I found Walter Sullivan. He told me everything. About the contract. About Charles Whitfield. About what they did to you. Vivian's hand reached for hers, gripping tighter than Addie expected. Her eyes filled with tears, but there was something else there too. Something fierce and determined beneath the grief. Something that had been waiting a very long time for exactly this moment. I'm not angry that you never told me, Addie said carefully. I just need to know if you're ready. Because tonight, at midnight, they're going to try to bury this forever. And I don't think I can stop them without you. Vivian's hand moved slowly toward the plastic board resting on her lap. Her fingers trembled with effort, each letter costing her more than the last, but she pressed forward anyway, determined. Addie's death breath caught. Fight, she whispered. You want me to fight? Vivian tapped again, harder this time. Y-O-U with you. Addie felt tears sting her own eyes now, gripping her grandmother's hand tightly. Then we fight together, she said. Tonight, whatever it takes. A nurse entered quietly, checking monitors, and Addie had an idea, sudden and clear. Is there a way, she asked, to set up a video call? Something I could show at a public meeting tonight if needed. The nurse considered, glancing at Vivian. We have a tablet for family calls, she said slowly. If Mrs. Mercer is willing, and if her doctor doesn't object, I don't see why not. Vivian's hand tightened around Addie's, her eyes steady, resolved. She was willing. The nurse stepped out to check with the attending physician, leaving grandmother and granddaughter alone a moment longer. Addie leaned her forehead gently against Vivian's hand. I wish you could tell me all of it, she whispered. Every single year you carried this alone. Vivian's hand moved once more against the blanket, slow but deliberate. LTR later. Addie smiled despite the tears. Even now, even like this, her grandmother still knew exactly how to have the last word. By late afternoon, Walter had assembled everything he needed. The original, unaltered 1989 contract, matching precisely the terms Vivian had always believed she'd signed. County filing records showing a suspicious 3-month gap between the signing date and the official recording date, a gap Walter had flagged decades earlier, but never had the resources to fully investigate. And, most importantly, a forensic document examiner, an old colleague Walter still trusted, willing to review the paper stock and signature placement on short notice. The original agreement was typed on a different typewriter than the filed version. The examiner explained that afternoon, comparing documents under bright light in Walter's cramped office. Font spacing is inconsistent. Someone retyped these pages to change specific terms, then reattached the original signature page. Can you testify to that? Walter asked. Formally, given enough time, absolutely, the examiner said. Informally, right now, looking at these documents side by side, I'd stake my professional reputation on it. Margaret, meanwhile, had confirmed something equally critical. The embroidered initials hidden in the gown's collar were the ones she'd discovered during the gala. They matched a private mark Vivian had used exclusively on original House of Mercer couture designs, documented in archived photographs from 1989 and 1990. This mark, Margaret said, showing Addie a photograph beside the actual gown, appears nowhere else. It's not decorative. It's a designer's signature, hidden intentionally, the way an artist might sign a painting somewhere on a... Why hide it? Addie asked. Craftspeople sometimes did that, Margaret explained, when they suspected their work might be copied or stolen. A hidden signature that couldn't be removed without unraveling the entire seam. Addie stared at the small silver letters, barely visible against the fabric. VM-proof, quietly stitched into silk decades ago, waiting patiently for someone to finally need it. She knew, Addie said softly. Even then, she knew something like this might happen. Walter, overhearing from across the room, nodded slowly. Your grandmother, he said, was smarter than every single person who ever tried to take advantage of her. It just took the rest of the world 30 years to catch up. He checked his watch again, the number of remaining hours shrinking faster than any of them liked. We should go over exactly how we present this tonight, he said. One chance. We need to make it count. Owen showed up at Walter's office just before 6, a bag of sandwiches in hand, having heard through Margaret exactly where everyone had disappeared to all day. Figured nobody's eaten since breakfast, he said, setting the bag down. Can't fight a Whitfield on an empty stomach. Told Addie that myself, years ago it feels like, though it was only this week. Feels longer, Addie admitted, managing a tired smile. Owen studied the documents spread across the desk, the old photographs, the forensic report. This is really it, he said quietly. After all these years. If we can get through that door tonight, Walter said. Board meetings like this one aren't exactly in the habit of welcoming uninvited guests. You let me worry about the door, Owen said. I've known the club's head of security since high school. Man owes me for 3 suits and a wedding tuxedo he never paid full price for. Walter raised an eyebrow, faintly amused despite the tension in the room. Small towns, he said. Everybody owes somebody something eventually. Preston spent that entire Friday convinced the worst had already passed. The morning's news coverage had died down somewhat. No new evidence had surfaced publicly. Whatever Margaret Voss had claimed, without documentation to back it up, seemed to be fading quietly into rumor. By evening, he felt confident enough to relax, sipping a drink in the country club's private lounge, while board members began arriving for the midnight vote. Gerald joined him shortly before 10, looking marginally more composed than he had earlier in the week, though something in his eyes still carried tension he couldn't quite hide. The vote should go smoothly, Gerald said, settling into a chair. Once the assets transfer, this entire matter becomes irrelevant. Historical curiosity, nothing more. And if that appraiser resurfaces with something concrete? Preston asked. She won't, Gerald said, though his voice lacked full conviction. Whatever she thinks she has, without proper documentation, it means nothing legally. People believe rumors for a few days. Then they move on. Preston nodded, wanting badly to believe him. He thought again of the question that had followed him home the night before, the one he still hadn't found a way to silence. He didn't ask it out loud. Outside, unnoticed by either man, a modest sedan pulled into the country club's parking lot, headlights cutting briefly through the darkness before switching off. Walter Sullivan stepped out first, moving slower than he once had, but with unmistakable purpose. Addie followed, gown left at home this time, dressed simply, carrying instead a leather folder containing decades of buried truth. Margaret came next, phone in hand, a tablet tucked carefully under her arm, connected and ready. They walked toward the entrance together, 3 unlikely allies, arriving with less than 2 hours before midnight. The board meeting hadn't started yet, but the real trial was about to begin. The conference room fell silent the moment Walter Sullivan walked through the door. Board members glanced up from their papers, confused by the unexpected arrival of an elderly stranger none of them immediately recognized, flanked by the young woman whose face had dominated local news all week. Preston rose from his seat immediately. "This is a private board meeting," he said sharply. "I'm afraid you'll need to leave." Walter didn't stop walking. "My name is Walter Sullivan," he said, voice steady despite his age. "I was Vivian Mercer's attorney in 1989. when your grandfather, Charles Whitfield, forced her out of the very company this foundation was built upon. Gerald's face drained of color. That's a serious accusation, he said carefully, made without any evidence. Walter set his leather folder on the conference table, opening it slowly, deliberately. I have evidence, he said. The original 1989 partnership agreement, matching exactly the terms Vivian Mercer always believed she'd signed. The falsified version filed 3 months later, showing significant undisclosed alterations. Forensic analysis confirming those pages were retyped and reattached to an original signature. He slid the documents across the table. I also have county filing records, he continued, showing an unexplained 3-month delay between signature and recording, a delay your family never adequately accounted for, then or now. The room had gone completely still, board members leaning forward, reading documents with growing alarm. This is absurd, Preston said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. Decades-old paperwork proves nothing. Even if these documents are real, there's no way to connect their alteration directly to my family. Margaret stepped forward, setting the gown's collar photograph on the table beside the contracts. Perhaps this will help, she said. This embroidered mark, hidden in the collar of the gown your grandfather's foundation apparently never noticed existed, matches Vivian Mercer's documented private signature mark, used exclusively on original House of Mercer designs. She pulled out a second photograph. An old ledger page, water-damaged but legible, listing company assets transferred into the newly formed Whitfield Charitable Foundation in 1991. Among the listed assets, in careful, formal handwriting, 3 words stood out clearly. Mercer Design Group. Your foundation, Margaret said quietly, wasn't built from nothing. It was built from a company your family took, using documents that appear to have been deliberately falsified. Gerald's hands shook slightly against the table. Even if any of this were true, he said, voice tight, it happened decades ago. There's no legal recourse remaining. Statutes of limitations, if nothing else, protect this family from civil liability, perhaps, Walter interrupted calmly. Though I'd argue that point in court, given the deliberate concealment involved. But fraud committed against a charitable structure, especially one still actively receiving public donations and government matching funds today, opens an entirely different set of legal questions. Ones I intend to raise formally first thing Monday morning. The room buzzed with murmured conversation, board members exchanging alarmed glances. Preston's carefully constructed composure finally cracked. This is insane, he said, voice rising. You're accusing my family of fraud based on old paperwork and a hidden stitch pattern? I'm accusing your family, Walter said evenly, based on 30 years of documented evidence. I kept precisely because I always suspected this day might come. Constance Ridley, the longtime board member who had murmured her suspicions to a colleague only 2 nights earlier, rose slowly from her seat. Mr. Sullivan, she said, I've sat on this board for 15 years. I've never once seen a full accounting of exactly how this foundation acquired its original assets. I always assumed someone else had reviewed that history properly. Nobody had, Walter said simply. That was rather the point. Franklin Reyes, at the head of the table, looked visibly ill. If what you're saying is accurate, he said slowly, this board has spent 30 years unknowingly benefiting from a fraud committed against a private citizen. That's not a small thing to sit with. No, Walter agreed. It isn't. Preston sat frozen in his chair through all of it, watching decades of certainty collapse in real time. He kept waiting for his father to say something, anything that might make this all make sense again. Gerald's mouth opened once, then closed, no words coming out at all. Before Preston could respond, Margaret raised her tablet, angling it toward the board. There's someone who'd like to say something, she said quietly. Or rather, someone who's finally ready to be heard. The screen connected, showing Vivian Mercer sitting upright in her room at Brookhaven, a nurse standing quietly beside her, the plastic communication board resting carefully on her lap. A hush fell over the room. Several older board members, longtime residents of Ashworth Falls, straightened in their seats, recognizing her immediately despite the passage of decades. Mrs. Mercer, Walter said gently, leaning toward the tablet. Can you confirm, for the record, that the contract I've just shown this board matches the original agreement you signed with Charles Whitfield in 1989? Vivian's hand moved slowly toward her board. Every person in the room watched, silent as she tapped out her answer. one letter at a time, her effort visible, her determination unmistakable. Weiss, a quiet murmur rippled through the room. Walter continued, voice careful and steady. And can you confirm that the terms filed with the county 3 months later did not match what you originally agreed to? Vivian's hand moved again, slower this time, exhaustion beginning to show, but she didn't stop. Yestchild, they lied. Preston stared at the screen, something shifting visibly behind his eyes, the full weight of what his family had built finally beginning to settle over him. Gerald said nothing at all, staring down at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Dorothy Hayes, who had quietly followed Walter and Addie into the room moments earlier, stepped forward now, voice steady despite the shake in her hands. I want it on record, she said, clearly, that I remember Vivian Mercer's shop. I remember buying a dress from her, made with more care than anything I've owned since. And I remember this town allowing her name to disappear, because speaking up felt dangerous. She looked directly at Gerald. I'm not afraid anymore, she said. Whatever happens to my assistants, whatever happens to me, I would rather lose everything than stay silent while history repeats itself in front of me. 2 other elderly residents, drawn by word of the commotion spreading through the club, appeared in the doorway, nodding quietly in support. The silence that had protected the Whitfield family for over 30 years was finally, completely, breaking apart. The board chairman, Franklin Reyes, cleared his throat, visibly shaken. Mr. Whitfield, he said, addressing Gerald directly, is there any part of what we've just heard that you can honestly refute? Gerald opened his mouth, then closed it again, the silence stretching long and damning. I was barely out of college, he finally said quietly, when my father made those decisions. I didn't create this situation. But you've spent 30 years benefiting from it, Walter said, and this past week, you actively worked to bury the truth rather than correct it, even as your own son publicly accused an innocent woman of theft to protect your family's secret. Gerald had no answer for that. Franklin Reyes turned to the rest of the board, expression grim. I move, he said, that we postpone tonight's vote indefinitely, pending a full independent investigation into the Foundation's original formation and asset history. The motion passed unanimously, board members raising their hands almost in unison, eager suddenly to distance themselves from whatever scandal was unfolding. A county sheriff's deputy stood quietly near the back of the room. One of the board members had called him earlier, after the accusations first surfaced. He had arrived expecting a minor property dispute. Instead, he found himself witness to something far larger. I'll need copies of all of this, he said, gesturing toward Walter's documents. This is well beyond anything I can sort out tonight, but it's not staying in this room either. Walter nodded, already prepared. I have copies for exactly that purpose. Preston sank back into his chair, the weight of everything finally crashing down around him. This isn't fair, he said quietly, almost to himself. I didn't do any of this. I was just trying to save my position. Walter regarded him with something almost like pity. Your grandfather built an empire on someone else's stolen dream, he said. Your father spent 30 years protecting that lie. And you, given the choice to do something different, chose instead to humiliate an innocent young woman on live television, rather than ask a single honest question. Preston had nothing left to say. Across the room on the tablet screen, Vivian Mercer watched everything unfold with quiet, exhausted dignity. For the first time in 30 years, the truth was finally standing in the room instead of hiding from it. The following weeks moved quickly. An independent forensic audit, conducted by a state-appointed investigator, confirmed everything Walter's documents had suggested. The original 1989 partnership agreement was authentic. The filed version showed clear, deliberate alteration. Signature analysis confirmed the same conclusion the private examiner had reached days earlier. The State Attorney General's office opened a formal inquiry into the Foundation's original formation, citing possible fraud against a charitable structure still actively receiving public donations. Gerald retained a defense attorney within days, though even his own lawyer reportedly urged him toward a settlement rather than a prolonged fight. Reporters camped outside the Whitfield estate for nearly a week straight. Gerald gave no interviews. His silence, once his family's greatest shield, had finally become just another headline. At the courthouse downtown, the same clock that had chimed the same 12 notes for over 100 years kept marking time as usual, indifferent to the fact that the family whose name graced half the buildings around it was for the first time in generations, being asked to account for itself. Faced with overwhelming evidence and mounting public pressure, the Whitfield Foundation's board voted to formally acknowledge Vivian Mercer as the rightful founding owner of the original design company. It was now recognized as the true financial foundation of decades of charitable work. Gerald Whitfield resigned from the foundation's leadership entirely. He faced a formal investigation into decades of financial misconduct. The full legal proceedings would stretch on for months beyond the story most of Ashworth Falls would ever witness directly. Preston, stripped of his anticipated board position, disappeared from public life for a while, his name quietly removed from gala invitations and charity dinners he'd once dominated. Some said he left town entirely. Others said he simply learned, finally, what it felt like to stand somewhere he no longer belonged. Months later, a letter arrived at the tailor shop, addressed simply to Miss Mercer. No return address. Addie almost didn't open it. Inside was a single page, handwritten, the penmanship careful in a way that suggested several failed attempts before this one. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for any," it read. "I only wanted you to know that I think about that night more than you'd probably believe. My grandfather built something on a lie, and I spent my whole life standing on top of it without ever once looking down. I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to finally look." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Addie folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, not quite ready to forgive, not quite willing to discard it either. Some things she was learning didn't resolve as neatly as a single gala night. They just settled slowly into something a person learned to carry. The foundation itself underwent a quiet but meaningful transformation. Its official name changed, not erasing the Whitfield family's decades of genuine charitable contributions, but adding, finally, the name that should have been there from the very beginning: the Mercer Whitfield Community Foundation. Funding for Brookhaven senior residents and for elder care programs across the county not only continued but expanded, boosted by a substantial settlement negotiated on Vivian's behalf. Dorothy Hayes received a formal, public apology, along with a small plaque placed near the foundation's entrance, honoring residents who had waited decades for the truth to surface. At the small unveiling ceremony, Franklin Reyes stood beside her, reading the inscription aloud for those gathered, to those who remembered, and finally spoke. Dorothy's daughter had driven up for the occasion, standing quietly beside her mother, hearing for the first time the full story Dorothy had carried alone for so long. "You should have told me," her daughter said afterward, voice thick with emotion. "All those years. I was protecting you," Dorothy said, "or so I told myself. Mom, you didn't need to protect me from the truth." Dorothy considered that a long moment, watching a group of children run past on the lawn outside. "No," she agreed softly. "I don't suppose I did." She visited the plaque often after that, running her fingers over the engraved letters, remembering a dress she'd worn once, long ago, made with more care than anything since. Rosa Delgado's follow-up segment for Channel 9 ran the following Sunday evening, timed to close out the story that had gripped the town for over a week. She interviewed Franklin Reyes, who spoke candidly about the board's decision, admitting he wished questions had been asked decades sooner. "We had every opportunity to look closer," he told Rose, "and for 30 years, we simply didn't. I think that's a lesson this whole board needs to sit with, not just move past." She interviewed Dorothy Hayes, who spoke simply about a shop on Larch Street and a young designer who had once made her feel beautiful on her daughter's wedding day. "I stayed quiet because I was scared," Dorothy admitted on camera, "scared of losing what little stability I had left. I think a lot of people my age understand that fear. I hope this story gives some of them the courage I finally found." And she interviewed Addie, standing outside the newly reopened shop, sunlight catching the freshly painted sign behind her. "What do you want people to take from this?" Rosa asked, "after everything that's happened?" Addie considered the question a long moment before answering. "That the people we overlook the most," she said, "usually have the most worth listening to. My grandmother spent 30 years being told. Her voice didn't matter. She never once stopped believing it did." The segment closed on a slow shot of the shop's new sign, gold letters catching the late afternoon light. At the diner on 5th Street, the same regulars who had watched Preston's press conference days earlier gathered again to watch Rosa's closing segment. "Told you there was more to that girl than a discount dress," the older man said, nodding along to the television. "You didn't tell me anything of the sort." The waitress shot back, laughing despite herself. "You just stood there staring at the screen, same as the rest of us." But even as they teased each other, something in the diner had shifted. The easy cynicism that usually greeted any mention of the Whitfield name had softened, just slightly, replaced by something closer to hope. Ashworth Falls had spent 30 years assuming certain names simply mattered more than others. For the first time in a long while, that assumption no longer felt quite so certain. On a quiet Saturday morning, 6 weeks after the gala that started everything, Addie stood outside the old tailor shop on 5th and Larch, holding a small brass sign in her hands. Owen stood beside her, arms crossed, unable to hide his smile. "You sure about this?" he asked. "Changing the name after all these years?" "I'm sure," Addie said. She climbed the small stepladder Owen had set up earlier, carefully removing the old sign above the door, the one that had simply read Brooks Tailoring for nearly 30 years. In its place, she hung the new one. House of Mercer Couture, S. 1985, reopened. Beneath the shop's main lettering, in smaller script, a second line had been added, one Addie had insisted on personally, in honor of Vivian Mercer, who never stopped believing in beautiful things, even in silence. Inside, the old locked trunk sat proudly near the front window, now lid open. The original gown stood displayed carefully on a mannequin beside it, protected under glass. A small plaque explained its history to anyone curious enough to ask. It was no longer hidden. It was no longer a secret. It was simply finally home. Owen had already taken on 2 apprentices that week, both of them young women eager to learn a trade nobody seemed to teach anymore. He liked to joke that the shop finally had enough hands to keep up with its new reputation. One of the apprentices, a 19-year-old named Sasha, who had grown up 2 streets over, admitted shyly that she'd asked for the position specifically because of the story she'd seen on the news. "I didn't know you could still build something like that," she told Addie, running her fingers carefully along a length of fabric. "From nothing. Just patience and good hands." "You can," Addie said. "It just takes longer than anyone tells you it will." Sasha nodded, considering that a moment, threading a needle with more focus than the task strictly required. "My mom said I was crazy, wanting to learn sewing when there's an app for everything now," she admitted. "I told her some things shouldn't be left to an app." "Your mother sounds like she raised you right regardless," Addie said, smiling. Customers had started coming from towns over an hour away. Some simply wanted to see the gown behind the glass. Others hoped for a piece of the same craftsmanship that had once made House of Mercer Couture famous. Margaret stopped by that same afternoon, bringing with her a formal certificate of authentication, framed now, ready to hang beside the gown for good. "Every piece deserves its paperwork eventually," she said, smiling as she hung it herself. Walter Sullivan closed his office for good later that same month. He'd practiced law in Ashworth Falls for over 50 years, longer than most of his clients had been alive, and he'd always assumed he'd simply keep working until his hands finally refused to hold a pen. But the week after the board meeting, sorting through the same filing cabinet that had held Vivian's folder for 30 years, he realized something had finally settled inside him that had been unsettled for a very long time. He stopped by the reopened shop before locking up the office for the last time. "I kept my promise," he told Vivian, who had come by that afternoon in her wheelchair, Addie pushing her gently through the front door. "Took longer than either of us expected, but I kept it." Vivian's hand found the plastic board resting in her lap. "THNKYOU." Walter's eyes grew unexpectedly damp. "No," he said quietly. "Thank you for trusting an old lawyer with something this important, and for having the patience to wait 30 years for the right moment to use it." He retired to a small cabin 2 hours north the following spring. He made a point of visiting Ashworth Falls every few months. He always stopped first at the shop on 5th and Larch, just to see how the new generation was carrying the name forward. The head nurse at Brookhaven, a woman named Patricia, who had cared for Vivian since her admission 2 years earlier, mentioned something to Addie in passing that same week. "I've worked here a long time," Patricia said. "I've seen a lot of patients lose their voice. Most of them lose something else along with it. Their fight, maybe. Their sense that anything they think still matters. And my grandmother?" Patricia smiled, glancing down the hallway toward Vivian's room. "Your grandmother never lost that," she said. "Not for one single day. I just don't think any of us understood until now." exactly what she'd been holding on to all this time. That afternoon, Addie drove to Brookhaven, as she did every day, though today felt different. She wheeled her grandmother out to the small garden behind the residence, sunlight warm against their faces, the plastic communication board resting, as always, on Vivian's lap. "We reopened the shop today," Addie said softly. "Your name is on the sign again." Exactly like it should have been all along. Vivian's eyes glistened, her hand reaching slowly for Addie's. She tapped out a message, slower now, tired from the long emotional weeks behind them. But every letter still deliberate, still hers. Proud. Addie felt tears slide down her cheeks, holding her grandmother's hand tightly. "I'm proud of you too," she whispered, "for holding on to the truth all those years, even when it cost you everything, and for finally letting me help you carry it." They sat together in comfortable silence, the kind that no longer needed words to feel complete, watching birds move between the garden's old oak trees. A breeze moved through the garden, carrying with it the faint scent of cut grass and something sweeter, honeysuckle maybe, growing somewhere along the fence line. Vivian tilted her face toward it, eyes closed, looking for a moment exactly like the young woman in that black and white photograph, pins between her lips, certain of exactly who she was. A few residents wandered past, some of them pausing to nod at Vivian, a quiet kind of respect in their eyes that hadn't been there a few months earlier. Word had traveled through Brookhaven the same way it had traveled through the rest of town. An older man Addie didn't recognize stopped beside their bench, hat in hand. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, nodding respectfully. "My late wife used to talk about a dress you made for her years and years ago. Said it was the finest thing she ever owned. I just wanted you to know that." Vivian's eyes filled with tears again, her hand pressing gently against her chest. The man nodded once more and continued on his way, leaving grandmother and granddaughter alone with the quiet weight of a life finally being seen again. Somewhere across town, a new sign caught the afternoon light above a small shop on 5th and Larch. A name restored after decades of silence. A family's dignity finally returned to where it always belonged. There's a lesson in stories like this one if you're willing to sit with it a while. Power doesn't always look like wealth or status or a name stitched onto the side of a building. Sometimes it looks like an old woman, unable to speak, who kept fighting anyway, one careful letter at a time. Sometimes it looks like a granddaughter, brave enough to wear the truth into a room full of people who underestimated her. Sometimes it looks like an old lawyer keeping a promise for 30 years, simply because someone once trusted him with it. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor with a cane, deciding one evening that silence had cost her enough. And sometimes, the people we overlook the most are carrying stories far bigger than we ever gave them credit for. The ones who serve our coffee, the ones who mend our clothes, the ones who sit quietly in a nursing home down the hall. Vivian Mercer spent 30 years in silence, but she never once stopped believing that the truth, however long it took, would eventually find its way back into the light. Maybe that's worth remembering, the next time we're tempted to underestimate someone simply because life has made them quiet. Dignity isn't loud. It never needed to be. It just needed someone, eventually, brave enough to listen. Ashworth Falls had needed 30 years to learn that lesson. Some towns, it turns out, are slower learners than others. But they get there eventually if enough people finally decide to stop looking away.